In 1978, a fearless Maine lighthouse keeper vanished during a violent storm, leaving behind only a cryptic log entry and unanswered questions. 14 years later, divers breaching the sealed lantern room uncover a rusted tin containing her final writings, a roll of undeveloped film, and a brass whistle, clues that expose a night of trespass, smuggling, and a cover-up that has kept her fate hidden in the fog for over a decade. The sea was restless that morning, its gray surface heaving under a low ceiling of clouds. Maggie Cole stood at the harbor's edge, the wind lifting strands of her hair as she watched a dive crew load gear onto a weather-worn boat. Out beyond the breakwater, the old Calverton Lighthouse rose from a jagged spit of rock, its faded white tower streaked with salt and rust. For 14 years, it had been nothing more than a silhouette in the distance, locked and left to decay. The night her Aunt Eleanor vanished in 1978 had been much like this one wind curling off the Atlantic, a storm pushing in fast, fog curling low over the waves. Maggie had been 12, huddled in her bedroom while her parents argued downstairs about whether Eleanor would be safe riding out the weather alone. The next morning, the lighthouse beam was gone, and Eleanor was never seen again. The Coast Guard's explanation was blunt. She must have slipped and been swept into the sea. Maggie had never believed it. Now, a section of the lighthouse's lower wall had collapsed during a recent gale, revealing a narrow opening into the long-sealed structure. Preservationists had hired divers to assess the damage and recover anything worth saving before the rest gave way. When the call came asking Maggie to document the find, she had hesitated, knowing it would mean confronting the unanswered questions that had shadowed her family for years. A gull cried overhead as she stepped onto the deck, her boots slick against the wet boards. The captain gave a short nod, and the engine's low rumble began. As the boat cut through the swells, the lighthouse grew larger, its windows black and empty. Maggie kept her eyes fixed on the tower's crown, where the lantern room sat like a glass cage. It had been locked since the day after Eleanor vanished, the rusted door untouched by salt or human hand. She tightened her grip on the compass in her pocket, a gift from Eleanor on her 10th birthday. The metal was warm from her palm, its needle steady despite the rocking boat. She told herself she was here as a historian, to record what was found, but deep down she knew the truth. She had come to find her aunt, or at least to understand what had really happened on that storm-lashed night. The boat drew closer to the rocks, the swells rising higher as the lighthouse loomed overhead. Its paint had long since surrendered to the elements, peeling in ragged strips that fluttered in the wind. The iron railings around the balcony were streaked with rust, and the glass panes of the lantern room reflected the dim light in fractured glints. Maggie had spent years studying photographs of this place, but seeing it now in person felt like stepping into one of her own memories. The divers began unloading their gear, speaking in short, focused bursts. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a salt-and-pepper beard, glanced at her. "The lower access is tight," he said, "but we can get in through the breach. You'll want to stay topside until we know it's stable." She nodded, though her eyes kept drifting upward to that locked room. She imagined Eleanor standing there on her final night, the storm crashing against the tower, her lamp casting a beam through the rain. Maggie's father used to say that Eleanor had been unshakable, that she would have fought to the last moment if danger came. The official report had called her death a tragic accident, but the ransacked quarters and the missing logbook had always suggested otherwise. The boat's hull scraped gently against the weathered dock, and Maggie followed the crew across slick planks. The air smelled of salt and rust, and the cries of seabirds echoed against the stone. They made their way to the breach in the lower wall, where seawater lapped at the jagged opening. The lead diver secured a line and disappeared inside, his headlamp casting a brief arc of light before vanishing into the dark. Maggie stood on the rocks, the wind tugging at her jacket. She could hear the faint sounds of movement from within, metal clinking against stone. Minutes later, the diver's voice crackled over the radio. "Stairs intact. Keeper's quarters partially submerged." Evidence of damage not caused by weather. Maggie felt her pulse quicken. She didn't need him to explain. If the interior damage wasn't from the sea, it meant something else had happened here. Something human. She looked up at the lantern room again, its locked door still holding whatever secrets Eleanor had left behind. The thought settled heavy in her chest. If that door opened, the past might finally speak. The first diver emerged from the breach, water streaming from his suit, his expression marked by something between curiosity and unease. He pulled off his mask and nodded toward Maggie. "You'll want to see this." The quarters looked like someone left in a hurry, or was made to. Maggie followed him carefully, stepping through the jagged opening into the cool, damp air of the lighthouse interior. Her boots splashed into ankle-deep water, the floor beneath slick with algae. The beam from her flashlight cut through the dimness, illuminating peeling paint, warped floorboards, and a desk tipped on its side. A chair lay half-submerged, one leg splintered. The walls bore faint waterlines from years of flooding, but amid the decay there were details that didn't fit. A teacup, still upright on a shelf. A jacket draped over the back of a chair as if someone had intended to return. On the wall above the desk, a framed photograph hung crooked, showing Eleanor in her keeper's uniform, smiling against the backdrop of the very balcony outside. Maggie's throat tightened. She remembered the day that picture had been taken. Eleanor had sent her a postcard afterward, telling her that the sea was a companion you had to respect but never trust. She moved toward the narrow spiral staircase, its iron steps slick with rust. Halfway up, the ascent was blocked by a tangle of collapsed beams and seaweed clinging to the metal. The divers were already working to clear it, prying apart the rotted wood and pushing debris down into the water below. "Door's still locked up there," one of them said over his shoulder. "Looks like no one's been inside since it was sealed." Maggie stared up through the dim shaft of light filtering down from the lantern room. That lock had stood for 14 years, the last barrier between her and whatever had been left behind. She wondered if Eleanor had locked it herself, or if someone else had sealed it to keep people out. As the divers continued clearing the way, a gust of wind rattled the tower, and somewhere above, something metallic shifted and clanged. The sound was sharp and deliberate, echoing down the stairwell as if the lighthouse itself had just remembered she was there. The sound faded into the wind, leaving only the faint drip of water from the walls. Maggie kept her eyes fixed on the spiraling steps above, her hand tightening around the flashlight. The divers exchanged quick glances but said nothing, returning to their work with steady, deliberate motions. When the last beam was hauled aside, the path to the lantern room opened like a throat, dark and narrow. The lead diver tested the first few steps, pressing down to make sure they would hold. Rust flaked away under his boots, drifting down into the water below. He waved Maggie forward, and together they began the climb. The air grew cooler with each step, tinged with the faint scent of old oil and salt. The higher they went, the more the sound of the sea fell away, replaced by a hollow stillness that seemed to gather inside the walls. Maggie's heart thudded in her ears as they reached the final landing. The door stood before them, its paint blistered and peeling, the heavy brass lock dulled with corrosion. It was an ordinary door in every sense, and yet Maggie felt the weight of its years pressing against her. This was the barrier that had held her aunt's final hours out of reach. The diver knelt and set to work on the lock, the metallic scrape of his tools loud in the silence. Maggie found her gaze drawn to the small window beside the door, its glass clouded but still intact. Through it, she could make out the blurred horizon where sea and sky met, just as Eleanor would have seen it on her last night. The lock resisted at first, groaning as if reluctant to yield. Then, with a sudden snap, it gave way. The diver pushed the door open, and a draft of stale, dry air swept past them. Dust hung in the beam of Maggie's flashlight, swirling like disturbed ghosts. Inside, the lantern room lay in shadow. The great lamp, long extinguished, stood silent at the center, its glass panels streaked with salt. In the corner, wedged behind the base of the lamp assembly, something small and metallic caught the light. Maggie stepped closer, her pulse quickening. She could already tell it had not been placed there by accident. Maggie crouched beside the base of the lamp, brushing away a thin layer of dust and grit. The object was a metal tin, no larger than a lunchbox, its surface mottled with rust. The edges were dented, as if it had been dropped and hastily retrieved. She reached out and ran her fingertips over the cool metal, feeling the faint ridges of an embossed maker's mark nearly obscured by corrosion. The diver knelt beside her, tilting his head toward the find. "Been up here a lot of years," he murmured. He set his gloves aside and helped her ease it free from the narrow gap where it had been wedged. The tin came loose with a reluctant scrape, leaving behind an imprint in the dust that suggested it had not been moved since it was placed there. Maggie set it on the wooden floorboards and tested the latch. It was stiff but not locked. When it finally yielded, a faint, musty scent escaped, carrying with it the dampness of years gone by. Inside, she saw a bundle of water-stained papers tied together with twine, a small canister of undeveloped film, and a tarnished brass whistle whose surface had gone dull with age. Her breath caught. She recognized the handwriting on the top page instantly. The slanted script, neat but hurried, was Eleanor's. The first visible words read simply, "If this is found, I was not alone." The diver glanced at her, sensing the weight of the moment. "You want to take this topside?" She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the whistle. As a child, she had seen her aunt wear it around her neck during storm watches, using it to signal the boats that strayed too close to the rocks. Maggie reached in and picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was heavier than she remembered, the metal cold and solid. She tucked the items carefully back into the tin, closing the latch with a soft click. As they began the descent, Maggie's mind turned over the meaning of those words in Eleanor's note. If she had not been alone, then someone else had been inside this lantern room that night. And if they had been here once, perhaps they had never truly left the shadow of the lighthouse at all. Back on the boat, the wind had picked up, pushing dark swells across the water. Maggie sat at a small table in the cabin, the tin between her hands. Salt spray rattled against the windows as the captain steered them toward the harbor. Across from her, the lead diver poured hot coffee into a paper cup and slid it her way, his eyes lingering on the box. She untied the twine from the bundle of papers, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The ink had bled in places, but Eleanor's words were still legible, each line pressed into the paper with a firmness that spoke of urgency. The first page was dated 2 days before her disappearance. It described an unknown vessel approaching the lighthouse late at night, its lights extinguished until it drew dangerously close to the rocks. Eleanor had signaled, but the ship did not respond. Instead, she wrote, "Figures had come ashore under the cover of the storm." Maggie turned the page, her stomach tightening as she read. Eleanor described hearing voices in the stairwell hours later, low and deliberate, as if someone was searching the tower. She had locked herself in the lantern room and written what she feared might be her final words. The last line on that page was smudged, the ink warped by a droplet that might have been seawater or something else entirely. The film canister lay on the table beside the papers, its cap still intact. Maggie resisted the urge to open it here, knowing it would need careful handling if there was any chance of recovering the images. The whistle sat next to it, gleaming faintly in the cabin light now that she had rubbed some of the tarnish away. The diver leaned forward. "She was trying to warn someone," he said quietly. "But who?" Maggie closed the tin and rested her hand on its lid. The motion of the boat rocked her gently, but her mind was already racing ahead. There had always been rumors about smuggling along this stretch of coast in the late 70s. If Eleanor had seen something she was not meant to see, the storm that night might have been more than just weather. The lighthouse was no longer just a relic in her family's past. It was a crime scene that had been waiting, locked in salt and rust, for someone to listen. The harbor came into view, a scatter of fishing boats bobbing against their moorings, their hulls creaking in the tide. Maggie stepped off the vessel with the tin tucked under her arm, the weight of it somehow heavier now that she knew what it contained. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the cold air, and somewhere in the back of her mind she heard Eleanor's voice as she used to, on long summer days, steady and certain, telling her that the sea keeps its secrets until it decides otherwise. Inside the small maritime museum where she worked, Maggie set the tin on her desk and drew the blinds. She wanted no interruptions. The building was quiet except for the groan of the old timbers and the hum of the radiator. She spread the papers out in sequence, careful to keep them in the same order Eleanor had tied them. Several entries detailed the days leading up to the storm. Eleanor had noticed supplies missing from the storage room, including 2 oil lamps, extra rations, and a set of spare keys. One note mentioned a shadow on the balcony late at night, a figure she could not clearly see through the fog. Another described the sound of footsteps pacing just below the lantern room, though she had been certain she was the only one in the tower. Maggie paused at an entry dated the very morning of her disappearance. The handwriting was rushed, almost jagged. It mentioned a man she did not recognize, one who claimed to be sent from the Coast Guard but had no identification. Eleanor wrote that he had insisted on checking the beacon, becoming agitated when she refused him entry. She suspected he was connected to the boat she had seen in the storm. The words cut off mid-sentence. Maggie traced the ink with her fingertip, feeling the sharp sting of the mystery deepening. She picked up the whistle again, rolling it in her palm. Its mouthpiece was dented, as if it had been struck against something hard. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the distant sound of waves against the breakwater. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the tin. Somewhere out there was the missing piece that would explain why her aunt had locked herself in that lantern room, and why, after all these years, the truth had still not washed ashore. The next morning brought a biting wind off the water, the kind that stung her cheeks as she crossed the narrow street to the harbormaster's office. Maggie had barely slept, her mind turning over Eleanor's words again and again. She needed to know if anyone had reported strange activity near the lighthouse in the days before the storm, or if any vessels had gone unaccounted for in the harbor logs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and engine oil. The harbormaster, a wiry man named Lowell, who had been working these docks since the early 70s, looked up from a ledger as she entered. His gaze drifted to the tin she carried, but he said nothing until she placed it gently on his desk and began unfolding the papers. He read in silence, his weathered hands steady on the pages. When he reached the entry about the unidentified man, his expression darkened. "I remember a night like that," he said slowly. "Wasn't logged official, but there were whispers. A trawler came in after dark, no lights, not one of ours." Maggie leaned forward. "What happened to it?" Lowell shook his head. "Slipped out before sunrise. Coast Guard didn't catch sight of her. Folks said she wasn't carrying fish." He hesitated, his eyes on the whistle. There were rumors then. Smuggling. And worse. She felt a chill settle through her. Smuggling in these waters was nothing new, but Eleanor had been meticulous in her duties. She would have reported it, even if it put her in danger. The last thing she would have done was let strangers into her lighthouse. Lowell tapped a finger on the tin. If she wrote this, she knew what she saw, but some people around here, they'd rather keep old storms buried. Outside, the wind rattled the flagpole, the rope clanging against metal. Maggie gathered the papers and returned them to the tin, her mind already moving ahead. If the trawler had been local, someone would know its name. And if it had returned after all these years, perhaps that was why Eleanor's story had remained locked away. As she stepped back into the cold, the lighthouse rose faintly in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the pale winter sky. Maggie had the uneasy feeling that the waves below it still guarded more than just Eleanor's final night. That afternoon, Maggie drove to the county archives, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of dust and old varnish. The heating system clanked as she signed in and made her way to the back room where maritime records were kept. Rows of ledgers and brittle folders lined the shelves, their spines faded from decades of handling. She set the tin on the table beside her and began pulling volumes from the year 1978, her gloves protecting the fragile pages. The harbor logs were meticulous, listing every vessel's arrival and departure. Most entries were mundane, filled with the familiar names of fishing boats and supply ships. But in the week before the storm that took Eleanor, Maggie spotted a gap. 3 consecutive nights had no recorded activity, an omission that stood out like a dark seam in otherwise steady cloth. She traced the missing dates with her finger. It matched perfectly with Eleanor's notes about the strange vessel. The absence was deliberate, as if someone had removed the entries entirely rather than forget to write them. Maggie flipped further ahead, searching for any Coast Guard reports, but found only a single incident form marked incomplete. The description was vague, referencing unverified offshore presence, with no follow-up. The archivist, a woman in her 60s with a neat gray bun, appeared at her elbow. "You're looking at the year of the Lighthouse storm, aren't you?" she said softly. Maggie nodded, and the woman's eyes darted toward the tin. "I remember your aunt, brave woman. There were things said back then, but people were afraid to speak too loud." Maggie hesitated, then asked, "Afraid of who?" The archivist's gaze lingered on the ledgers. "Not who, what they were bringing in. Drugs mostly. Sometimes people. The water hides more than it gives back." The words sank deep, heavy and cold. Maggie closed the ledger and slid it back into place, her thoughts tightening around the possibility that Eleanor had stumbled into something much larger than an isolated smuggling run. The kind of operation that would silence anyone who threatened it. As she left the archives, the late sun caught the windows of the distant lighthouse, turning them into sharp glints of light. For a moment, it felt as if Eleanor were there, watching, waiting for Maggie to follow the trail she had left locked away for 14 years. The following morning, Maggie drove along the rugged coastline to a weathered clapboard house that sat on the edge of a bluff. Lowell had given her a name the day before, an old fisherman who might remember more about that winter in 1978. His name was Arlen Pike, and he had spent most of his life at sea before retiring with a bad knee and a sharper tongue. Arlen answered the door with a wary squint, his eyes shifting to the tin under her arm before settling on her face. "You're Eleanor's niece," he said, more statement than question. When she nodded, he stepped aside without another word, motioning her into a living room that smelled faintly of tobacco and salt. They sat across from each other at a small table cluttered with nautical charts. Maggie laid out the whistle and the papers, careful to keep them from the edge, where a draft could catch them. Arlen leaned forward, his weathered hands tracing the lines of Eleanor's writing without touching it. "She wasn't wrong about that boat," he said quietly. "Came in under a new moon, no lights, hugging the shoreline where the radar's blind. I saw them from my skiff, figures moving on deck, quick and sure of themselves." His voice dropped lower. "One of them carried something over the side, looked like crates, but they were too careful for it to be just fish." Maggie asked if he had told anyone. Arlen's mouth twisted into a humorless smile. "Back then, you spoke up about certain men. You didn't get to fish another season. People vanished too easy. Storms were a good excuse." Her eyes went to the whistle, the dented mouthpiece glinting in the pale light. "Do you think they went up to the lighthouse?" "I know they did," he replied. "I saw their lanterns on the spiral stairs. And then," he paused, the memory tightening his jaw, "then the light went out. Whole coast went dark for near half an hour." Maggie felt the weight of his words settle over her. If Eleanor had refused them entry, they might have forced it. And if she had managed to drive them off, they would not have left quietly. When she left Arlen's house, the wind off the bluff was sharp and cold, carrying the distant echo of waves against stone. Somewhere beneath that sound was the faintest trace of a whistle, or perhaps just her own memory insisting it was still being blown. The storm rolled in fast that night, the kind that painted the sky in bruised grays and sent the tide clawing at the rocks. Maggie sat at her kitchen table with the tin open in front of her, the lamplight catching the uneven edges of Eleanor's papers. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them in their frames as if the sea itself wanted in. She picked up the final pages again, reading them slowly, letting each word settle. Eleanor had written of strange knocks at the lantern room door, always 3, in quick succession, followed by silence. She described the smell of oil and damp rope drifting up the stairwell and the scrape of boots on metal steps. One line stood out, the ink darker as if she had pressed the pen harder. "They are inside now." Maggie's hand trembled slightly as she set the page down. She imagined her aunt alone in that tower, wind howling outside, strangers closing in, and no way to call for help that would reach the mainland in time. The whistle was all she had, and even that would have been lost to the roar of the storm. Her phone rang suddenly, jolting her from the thought. It was Lowell. His voice was tense, edged with something like urgency. "You should come down to the docks," he said. "There's a boat here. You'll want to see." Maggie closed the tin, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the rain. The streets were slick, the harbor lights blurred through the mist. When she reached the docks, Lowell was standing near the end, his gaze fixed on a trawler tied loosely to the pier. Its paint was chipped, its name barely legible under layers of grime, but something about the curve of its hull made her skin prickle. "This one's been gone a long time," Lowell murmured. "Shows up tonight with no crew in sight. Looks a lot like the one people whispered about in '78. Maggie moved closer, the rain soaking through her hair. She thought of Eleanor's description, the way the vessel had crept in under darkness, silent and unmarked. Now, years later, it sat before her like a ghost pulled from the deep. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rust and brine. Maggie could not shake the feeling that whatever had happened to her aunt had not stayed buried at sea. It was drifting back to shore. The trawler loomed in the dim harbor light, its deck slick with rain and shadow. Maggie hesitated before stepping onto the gangway, the boards creaking under her weight. The vessel felt abandoned, yet not entirely still, as if it had arrived with a purpose and was waiting to fulfill it. She moved carefully, her boots slipping slightly on the wet planks, her breath clouding in the cold air. The wheelhouse door was ajar, swinging gently with the motion of the tide. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and old diesel. Charts lay scattered on the console, their edges curled from damp, and a rusted lantern sat unlit in the corner. Maggie's eyes caught on a crate shoved beneath the navigation table. The wood was stamped with a faded emblem she did not recognize, the corners reinforced with tarnished brass. She crouched to examine it, running her fingers along the rough grain. The crate had been pried open recently, the nails bent and splintered. Inside, beneath a layer of rotting canvas, was a coil of rope and a small oilskin pouch. Her pulse quickened as she untied it, revealing a handful of items that seemed strangely out of place: a brass button, a broken fountain pen, and a folded scrap of paper. The paper was damp, but the ink still held. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor's. The note was short, written in the same hurried style as her final journal entry. "If this reaches you, it means they came back." Maggie stared at the words, the weight of them pressing into her chest. She could almost see Eleanor slipping the note into the pouch, hiding it in the crate, hoping it might be found someday. But the fact that it was here now meant that whoever had taken her had returned to these waters, perhaps more than once. A sudden sound from the stern jolted her upright. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the deck. She stuffed the pouch into her coat pocket and stepped silently toward the wheelhouse door, her heart pounding. When she reached the railing, the harbor was empty, except for the faint glow of the lighthouse far down the coast. The footsteps had vanished as quickly as they had begun, leaving only the creak of the mooring lines and the steady slap of waves against the hull. Maggie tightened her grip on the pouch. Whatever had been set in motion in 1978 was not finished, and she was certain now that someone knew she was following its trail. The rain eased by morning, leaving the harbor wrapped in a thin veil of mist. Maggie sat in her car with the oilskin pouch on the passenger seat, staring at the note she had unfolded again and again through the night. The ink had bled slightly, but Eleanor's handwriting was still steady, her words deliberate. It was not a plea for help. It was a warning. She drove to the small historical society on Main Street, a place she knew kept shipping manifests and maritime records separate from the county archives. The curator, a quiet man named Henry, recognized her immediately and ushered her into a back room lined with metal filing cabinets. She explained what she was looking for without revealing too much, and he nodded as if he had been expecting her for years. From one of the cabinets, he pulled a narrow ledger bound in cracked leather. "This is the unofficial harbor book," he said softly. "Things that never made it into the public records." Maggie turned the pages carefully, each one filled with neat lines of handwriting. Then she saw it the week of the storm in 1978. Beside the date of Eleanor's disappearance, there was an entry written in a different hand. The lantern went dark at 21:47. Vessel unnamed, docked without clearance. No details followed, no signatures, only a small mark in the corner. Henry noticed her pause. That mark was used by a few men in town who handled the kind of shipments no one wanted traced. One of them bought a house on the bluff a year after your aunt vanished. He still lives there. Maggie closed the book slowly, the faint sound of the waves beyond the harbor filling the silence. Whoever had come that night had left more than just fear in their wake. They had stayed, hidden in plain sight, long after the storm passed. She thanked Henry and stepped outside, the morning light struggling to break through the mist. In the distance, the lighthouse stood faint and unmoving, its white walls barely visible against the pale sky. Maggie gripped the pouch in her coat pocket, feeling the edges of the brass button through the fabric. It was no longer just a relic from the past. It was a thread, and if she pulled hard enough, she was certain it would lead straight to the person who had been keeping Eleanor's truth locked in the dark for 14 years. The house on the bluff sat alone at the end of a winding dirt road, its paint worn to a dull gray by decades of salt and wind. Maggie parked far enough away that her tires would not be heard on the gravel, then walked the rest of the distance, her coat collar turned up against the chill. The place looked empty, but there was a faint trail of smoke rising from the chimney. She circled slowly, keeping to the edges where the grass grew tall. From the back, she could see the wide porch facing the water, its boards warped and dark with age. An old dory rested upside down near the shore, its hull cracked but still painted with the same faded emblem she had seen stamped on the crate aboard the trawler. Maggie's pulse quickened as she moved closer. The porch door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. She stepped inside and found herself in a room crowded with maritime clutter, coils of rope, chipped buoys, and a rack of oilskins hung in careful order. On the table lay a chart of the coastline, its surface marked with pencil lines and small X's along the outer shoals. One corner of the chart was weighted down by a rusted brass key. She lifted it and saw a faint engraving on the bow, "L.R. Lantern Room." The metal was cold in her hand, heavy with meaning. It was proof someone here had been inside the lighthouse long after it had been sealed. A sound from upstairs froze her in place, a slow, deliberate step, followed by the faint groan of an old floorboard. Maggie slid the key into her pocket and moved quietly toward the door, every nerve alert. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the tide was pulling back, revealing jagged black rocks below. She kept her pace steady until the house was behind her, then quickened her steps toward her car. The key felt like a burning coal in her pocket, each step making it more certain that the man in that house was not just connected to Eleanor's last night, but had kept a hold on the truth for years. As she reached the road, she glanced back once. A figure now stood at the upstairs window, unmoving, watching her go. Rain swept in again by evening, blurring the coastline into shifting shades of gray. Maggie sat in her small kitchen with the brass key on the table, its dull surface catching the lamplight. She turned it over in her palm, thinking about the man in the upstairs window and the years he had spent keeping this hidden. The thought of him moving freely through the lantern room while Eleanor's name faded into local legend made her stomach tighten. She called Lowell, her voice low. She told him about the key, the chart, and the emblem on the overturned boat. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of him drawing a slow breath. "If you're right, that key might open more than just a door," he said. "But if he knows you have it, you need to be careful." They agreed to meet at the harbor the next morning, just before first light. Maggie ended the call and sat in the stillness, the patter of rain against the windows loud in the quiet. Her gaze drifted to the tin of Eleanor's belongings on the counter, the whistle resting on top like a silent companion. She picked it up, the metal cool against her lips, and wondered if her aunt had felt the same helplessness the last time she used it. That night, sleep came in fitful fragments. She dreamed of the lighthouse, its spiral stairs slick with seawater, the beam above flickering like a dying candle. She could hear footsteps ahead of her, always just out of sight, and the distant sound of the whistle echoing through the wind. When she woke, it was still dark. The rain eased to a steady drizzle. She tucked the key into her coat and slipped the whistle into her pocket beside it. As she drove toward the harbor, the ocean lay to her right, black and restless under the early sky. Lowell was already there, waiting by his truck with a thermos of coffee. He studied her face, then the key, and gave a small nod. "If we're going up there, we need to do it before the tide turns," he said. Maggie glanced toward the distant shape of the lighthouse, its white tower barely visible in the gray dawn. For the first time since she had arrived in town, she felt certain she would step inside the place where her aunt had disappeared. Whether she would be ready for what waited there was another matter entirely. The morning tide was still low when they pushed off from the dock, the skiff rocking gently beneath their weight. Maggie sat in the bow, the brass key tucked safely inside her coat, while Lowell steered them out into the channel. The wind carried the briny scent of seaweed and the distant call of gulls. Ahead, the lighthouse rose from the rocks like a sentinel, its lantern room shrouded in fog. The closer they drew, the more she noticed the decay. Paint peeled in wide strips from the tower, and the iron railings along the balcony were red with rust. The storm-battered door at the base looked as if it had not been touched in years, but Maggie knew appearances could be deceptive. They tied off to the narrow landing and climbed the slippery steps. Lowell gave a cautious glance around before nodding toward the door. Maggie pulled the key from her pocket, its metal cold and solid in her palm. It slid into the lock with surprising ease, turning with a faint, deliberate click that sent a shiver down her spine. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of mold. Their footsteps echoed faintly as they stepped into the circular room, the stone walls weeping with moisture. The spiral staircase wound upward in a tight coil, each step coated in a fine layer of grit. Maggie trailed her hand along the railing as they climbed, her pulse quickening with every turn. Near the top, the light shifted, filtered through cracked panes of glass that surrounded the lantern room. The metal housing of the lamp stood silent and cold, dust thick on its surface. But it was not the lamp that drew her attention. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old tarpaulin, stood a weathered wooden chest. Maggie crossed the room, her boots scuffing against the warped floorboards. She pulled the covering aside, revealing deep gouges along the chest's edges, as though someone had pried at it long ago. Her hands hovered over the lid, but she hesitated, the air in the room feeling suddenly heavier, almost charged. Lowell stepped closer, his voice low. "If she left something here, it's been waiting for you a long time." Maggie gripped the edge of the lid, her fingers tightening as she prepared to open it, knowing that whatever lay inside might not just explain Eleanor's fate, but finally expose the secret that had kept the lighthouse's silence for 14 years. The chest gave a reluctant groan. As Maggie lifted the lid, the hinges stiff with rust. A wave of cold, stale air rose from within, carrying the scent of damp wood and something older, metallic. Inside, layers of oilskin had been wrapped tightly around a small tin, its surface mottled with corrosion. She lifted it carefully, the weight surprising for its size, and set it on the floor. Lowell knelt beside her as she eased the lid open. Inside lay a leather-bound logbook, its edges swollen from years of moisture, and a roll of undeveloped film, sealed in a plastic canister. Resting on top was a brass whistle, identical to the one in Eleanor's pouch, except this one bore a faint engraving along its side, the initials EFR. Maggie brushed her thumb over the letters, a sharp ache tightening in her chest. She opened the logbook slowly, the pages crackling with age. Eleanor's handwriting filled the early entries, neat and steady, describing weather patterns, supply runs, and routine maintenance. But the tone shifted near the final pages. The writing grew hurried, the strokes uneven. The last entry was dated the night of her disappearance. It mentioned an unidentified vessel approaching without lights, docking below despite the rising storm. Eleanor wrote of hearing voices shouting over the wind, the clatter of crates being moved. Then, abruptly, the entry ended mid-sentence, as if interrupted. Lowell met her eyes, his expression grim. "This is more than just bad weather," he said quietly. She saw something she wasn't meant to. Maggie turned the whistle over in her hand, imagining her aunt standing in this very room, watching strangers unload something under cover of darkness. The thought of her alone in the storm, caught between duty and danger, was almost unbearable. She slipped the whistle and the film into her bag, then closed the logbook and wrapped it again in the oilskin for protection. The tin felt heavier now, as though it carried not just the evidence, but the weight of 14 years of unanswered questions. As they descended the spiral stairs, the sound of the wind outside seemed sharper, the gusts rattling the glass above. Maggie knew that once they left, the lighthouse would return to its silence, but now she carried its voice with her, and she intended to make it heard. The rain had turned to a fine mist by the time they reached the skiff, the horizon nothing more than a smudge of gray where sea met sky. Maggie kept the tin clutched close, her fingers numb from the cold but unwilling to let it out of her grasp. Every time she thought about the logbook's final page, the abrupt break in Eleanor's words, she felt the same hollow unease, as if she had just walked in on something she was not supposed to see. Lowell rowed them back toward the harbor, his eyes scanning the water in a way that made her realize he was not just looking for navigation hazards. The man in the upstairs window came back to her mind, the slow, deliberate way he had watched her leave. If he had been connected to the trawler Eleanor wrote about, he might know exactly what she had found in the lantern room. When they reached the dock, the harbor lay quiet, most of the fishing boats already gone for the day. Maggie followed Lowell up the slick boards, the tin heavy at her side. They stopped at his truck, and he leaned against the door with a frown. "You need to keep this somewhere safe until we know more," he said, nodding toward her bag. "If this proves what I think it does, it's going to stir up the wrong kind of attention." She knew he was right, but a part of her bristled at the idea of letting the evidence out of her sight. Eleanor had carried her truth alone on the night she vanished, and Maggie would not let that truth disappear again. She told Lowell she would keep the tin in her room, hidden, until she could make copies of the logbook and get the film developed. That night, back in her rented house, she placed the tin on the table and set the whistle beside it. The mist outside thickened, dimming the streetlight to a pale halo. Somewhere beyond the harbor, a low horn sounded, and she thought of the dark silhouette of a ship moving without lights, just as Eleanor had described. She closed the curtains and locked the door, her thoughts churning. The answers were close now, close enough that she could almost see the shape of them through the fog. But she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous it would become to keep looking. Maggie woke before dawn to the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway. For a moment she lay still, listening, her pulse quickening. The rented house had old bones, and the wind often made it speak, but this sound was deliberate, measured. She slipped quietly from bed, her bare feet silent on the worn rug, and reached the door in time to hear the front latch click shut. By the time she stepped onto the porch, the mist had swallowed everything beyond a few yards. She thought she saw movement near the corner of the street, but it dissolved into the fog before she could be sure. The door had been locked when she went to bed, and yet someone had been inside. Her first thought was for the tin. She hurried to the kitchen table and found it still in place, the whistle beside it exactly where she had left it. But when she lifted the lid, the contents felt wrong. The logbook was there, the oilskin still wrapped tight, but the roll of film was gone. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing. Whoever had been inside knew exactly what they were looking for. The whistle was symbolic, the logbook detailed, but the film might hold images that could not be explained away. She imagined her aunt, standing in the lantern room with a camera, trying to capture proof of what she had seen that night. Maggie called Lowell, her voice sharp with urgency. He answered on the second ring, and she told him about the break-in and the missing film. He was silent for a moment, then said he would come over right away. When he arrived, he examined the lock and shook his head. No sign of force. Either they had a key or they knew how to pick it. His gaze shifted to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. If they took the film, they're nervous. And if they're nervous, it means you've got them cornered. Maggie gripped the whistle in her hand, feeling its weight, its history. She did not know who had taken the film or how much time she had before they came back for more. But she knew she could not stop now. The tide was turning, and the truth, like the beam from the lighthouse, was finally beginning to cut through the fog. By mid-morning the fog had begun to lift, revealing the harbor in fragments, as if the day itself was reluctant to wake. Maggie and Lowell sat in his truck near the waterfront, the logbook between them. Its pages were fragile, but the words inside carried a sharpness that cut through time. They were looking for anything Eleanor might have written that could point to who had approached the lighthouse that night, anything that might tie the events to someone still living in the town. One passage stood out. It mentioned a small fishing vessel named the Hawthorne, its name barely legible in the smudged ink. Eleanor had written that it arrived after midnight with no running lights and left before dawn, moving south toward the coves near Gull Point. Maggie read the line again, her mind circling the name. She had heard it before, whispered in connection to smuggling runs that had taken place in the late 70s. Lowell nodded when she said it aloud. The Hawthorne was registered to a man named Harris Crow. He ran supplies, sure, but there were rumors about other things. Things no one proved. He glanced out toward the docks, where a weathered trawler sat at anchor. His son's still here, runs one of the bigger boats now. The idea of confronting someone connected to that night sent a chill through Maggie, but she knew avoiding it would only keep her trapped in the same unanswered circle her family had been in for years. She agreed to go with Lowell to the fisheries office, where the harbor logs might still hold records from 1978. Inside, the air smelled of salt and old paper. Rows of ledgers lined the walls, each one thick with handwritten entries. The clerk, an older man with sun-leathered skin, barely looked at them as Lowell requested the book. For the week Eleanor vanished. When it arrived, Maggie flipped through the brittle pages until her finger landed on the name Hawthorne, marked in neat script under the date of the storm. Her chest tightened. There it was, proof that the vessel had been in the harbor that night. The entry included a departure time and, faintly, a note about cargo. But before she could read further, the clerk's eyes darted toward them, his jaw tightening. In that instant Maggie knew he had seen what she was holding, and worse, that he understood exactly what it meant. The clerk's stare lingered a moment too long, his expression carefully blank. Maggie closed the ledger slowly, aware of the sudden heaviness in the room. Lowell thanked the man, but his voice was tight, his movements deliberate as he slid the book back across the counter. The clerk's hands rested on it for a moment before he tucked it under the desk, out of sight, as if it were something dangerous that needed to be hidden away. Outside, the air felt colder despite the thinning fog. Maggie walked beside Lowell toward the truck, her pulse steadying only when they were moving again. "He knows more than he's letting on," she said. Lowell nodded without looking at her. "That entry wasn't supposed to be found. If Harris Crow's name comes up again, people around here will start closing doors." They drove toward the outer harbor where Crow's current boat was moored. The vessel was larger than she expected, its hull scarred from years of use, but the name stenciled on the side was fresh paint. Maggie could see a man on deck, tall and broad-shouldered, working on a tangled net. Even from a distance there was something about his stillness that felt calculated. Lowell parked a few slips away. "That's Thomas Crow," he said, "Harris's son. If the Hawthorne was involved that night, odds are he's heard the story. But getting him to talk will be another matter." They approached slowly, the sound of gulls overhead breaking the silence. Thomas straightened when he saw them, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning against the railing. His gaze moved between them, assessing, before settling on Maggie. "You're the one asking about the lighthouse," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to hold his eyes. "My aunt vanished there in 1978. I believe your father's boat was in the harbor that night." A faint smile touched his lips, though it held no warmth. "Lots of boats came and went in those days. The sea doesn't keep records worth trusting." His voice was low, almost casual, but there was an edge beneath it that made her skin prickle. Before she could answer, he turned away, picking up the net again as if the conversation were over. Maggie felt Lowell's hand on her arm, guiding her back toward the dock. They had not gotten answers, but the way Thomas Crow avoided the question told her they were finally pressing on a wound someone had tried for years to keep closed. That night, the wind came in off the water, carrying the faint briny tang of low tide, and Maggie could not sleep. She sat at the small kitchen table, the logbook open in front of her, the lamplight casting a golden pool across its pages. Her mind kept replaying Thomas Crow's expression, the measured calm in his voice that felt rehearsed, as if he had been expecting someone to come asking about that night for years. She turned to the page with the Hawthorne's entry, tracing the ink as if the letters themselves might give her more than what was written. The note about cargo was still faint, but readable now that her eyes had adjusted to the script. "Special delivery," it said, followed by a number she did not recognize. She copied it down on a scrap of paper, thinking it might be a code or shipment reference. The house creaked again, and this time Maggie's pulse spiked. She glanced toward the front door, but no latch clicked, no shadow passed the window. Still, the air felt different, charged. She stood and checked the locks, her breath quick and shallow. The whistle lay on the table beside the tin, and she picked it up, its cold metal pressing into her palm like a silent reassurance. In the morning, she brought the number to Lowell. He studied it for a moment before nodding. "That's not a date. It's a registry code. Belonged to a shipping manifest for offshore transfers. If your aunt saw what they were unloading, that's the kind of detail that would get her silenced." They decided to follow the trail to the old customs building, where decades of records had been stored in basement archives. The clerk there was younger, uninterested in small talk, and waved them toward the stacks without asking questions. The air below was damp and smelled of mildew, the walls lined with metal shelving. It took an hour of searching before Maggie found the manifest. The code matched perfectly, and the description of the cargo was stark. "Medical supplies." Her brow furrowed. It seemed harmless, yet something about it rang false. Lowell leaned over her shoulder, his voice low. "That was often the cover. You pack the crates with what you want, and the label does the lying." Maggie felt the weight of it then, the shape of the story forming. Whatever her aunt had seen that night, it had not been legal, and it had not been meant to leave the water. The manifest weighed heavy in Maggie's hands as she and Lowell left the dim basement. Outside, the gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the steady hush of the tide. She tucked the paper inside her coat, feeling the edge of it press against her ribs like a reminder not to lose momentum. The word medical echoed in her head, but not in any charitable sense. Lowell drove them back toward the harbor, his jaw set. "If we can tie Crow's boat to that cargo, we might finally understand what happened to Eleanor. But we have to be careful. People protect those kinds of secrets for generations." His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see someone following. They decided to check the boathouse where the Crows stored their equipment. It sat at the edge of the docks, weathered boards patched in places with mismatched planks. A padlock hung on the door, but when Maggie pressed her ear to the wood, she could hear faint shuffling inside. Lowell rapped twice on the frame, and the sound stopped. After a long pause, the door creaked open a few inches. An older man with sea-battered features peered out. Maggie recognized him from photographs she had seen in the archives. It was Harris Crow himself, older now but still carrying that air of command. His gaze swept over them and landed on the paper in Maggie's hand. "You've been digging," he said, voice low and flat. Maggie held his stare. "My aunt wrote about your boat the night she vanished. The Hawthorne was in the harbor, and now we have the cargo manifest. Tell me what was on those crates." Harris leaned on the doorframe, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever you think you've found, let it be. The sea takes people, always has. Sometimes the storm is the only answer you need." The words chilled her more than the wind off the water. Before she could reply, he closed the door and the padlock snapped shut again. Maggie stepped back, her heart thudding. Lowell touched her elbow, urging her toward the truck. As they walked away, she knew they were closing in. Harris Crow's refusal was not a dismissal. It was fear, and it told her that the truth was close enough to touch. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the windows of Maggie's small rental. She sat at the table with the tin and the whistle in front of her, the manifest unfolded beside them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Harris Crow's expression, not anger, but a guardedness, that spoke of someone who knew more than he was willing to say. She could not shake the feeling that the lighthouse had been more than a beacon that night, that it had been part of the exchange itself. Lowell called just after 9. His voice was tight, urgent. "Meet me at the pier. There's someone who wants to talk." She grabbed her coat and the whistle, slipping them into her bag before stepping into the damp salt air. The harbor lights glimmered off the black water as she hurried down the planks. A figure stood in the shadow of a piling, tall and wiry, a hood pulled low over their face. When she drew closer, the person lifted their head, and Maggie saw it was Thomas Crow. His eyes darted toward the boats, then back to her. "I don't know what you think you're going to prove," he said, "but my father didn't kill your aunt." Maggie held her breath, waiting for the rest. Thomas glanced at Lowell before lowering his voice. That night, she saw something she wasn't meant to. The crates weren't full of medicine. It was weapons smuggled in from overseas. My father was just the delivery. But when the storm hit, she tried to signal the Coast Guard from the lantern room. Her heart pounded. And Thomas's gaze fell to the wet planks beneath their feet. She never made it off the light. I don't know if she fell or if someone helped her over the rail, but when the storm cleared, she was gone. My father ordered the lantern room sealed the next day. The air between them felt heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Maggie searched his face for deceit, but all she saw was a man worn down by years of silence. Before she could press for more, Thomas stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the maze of moored boats. Maggie turned toward Lowell, the roar of the tide in her ears. The pieces were finally aligning, but the full picture was still shrouded in the same fog that had swallowed her aunt 14 years ago. The morning broke pale and cold. The horizon blurred where the sea met the sky. Maggie stood at the base of the lighthouse, its weathered stone rising above her like a sentinel. The lantern room, sealed for more than a decade, waited at the top. She and Lowell had secured permission to enter, the key heavy in her pocket. Inside, the spiral stairs groaned under their weight. The air grew cooler the higher they climbed, carrying the faint scent of salt and rust. When they reached the final landing, Maggie hesitated. For years this room had been locked away, the last place her aunt had been seen alive. Her fingers trembled as she fit the key into the lock. The door gave way with a reluctant creak. Sunlight spilled across the glass panes, revealing dust motes drifting in the stillness. In the center of the room sat the object the divers had found months earlier, a rusted tin resting on a small table. Maggie approached slowly, the whistle pressing against her side in her coat pocket. She lifted the tin's lid and found the bundle of papers inside, her aunt's handwriting looping across the pages. The words told the story Thomas had begun to reveal, describing the storm, the crates, the confrontation. The final page was smeared, the ink running where water had touched it. At the very bottom was a line that stopped her breath. "If I am gone, tell them I did not leave willingly." Maggie closed her eyes, the truth pressing against her like the weight of the tide. She could see it all now. Her aunt standing in this very room, the storm battering the glass. The lantern lit not just for ships but as a signal for help. And then, the sudden, irrevocable moment when she vanished into the night. Lowell stood quietly beside her, reading over her shoulder. "It's enough," he said softly. "They can't ignore this." Maggie slipped the papers back into the tin, holding it close. Outside, the wind had softened, the water glinting under the morning sun. She stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the sharp salt air, the same view her aunt had last seen. The lighthouse had kept its secrets for 14 years, but now, at last, it had given one back.